Hey everyone, it's the tiniest one back, and I've got the Ryuo and the Ryujin, I know I'm going to pronounce that wrong anyway, Asus coolers in for testing. So this one's a 240mm AIO, this one's a 360mm AIO. This one actually has Noctua fans as well. Both have got LCD screens built into the pumps. They all look very cool, but do they perform well? And are they quiet? First off, we will look at the Ryuo. I've got it all pretty much built up with the fans kind of connected as well, although the USB cable has come out just as I've started filming, which is what we would call Sod's Law in Blighty. So you do get really nice soft braided hose. It's as you would expect from an Asus based unit. You can also have the pump either way up, because if you have a look, you can see that you've got ROG writing on both sides, and in the software you can change which way round you want the screen to react. So that's a really nice point, and it does also give you some options with how you want the cabling to be. I would probably go with that way round if it was me, and then you can do some all mean fandango with the cables. So I'm just going to disconnect the fans, because what I did want to show you is the fans themselves have a very short 15cm cable length, which is going to help keep things tidy behind your rig. You've obviously got the two fan headers. It comes out of a single wire. They are flat cables as well. You do get a second header here, this PWM, and this you plug into either the CPU fan section or the water pump section on your motherboard. Remember, if you use the water pump section now, it's a full speed header, so it'll just make all the fans and everything in there just blow an absolute hoolie. So if you put it in the CPU one, that means you're going to get a little bit better control, and it'll be a little bit easier for you to get your head around once you get into the AI suite software. And then you've got another SATA to help power the screen and extra stuff for the fan, and then the USB cable that goes down round the back of the board, or at least I would put it round the back of the motherboard, right the way down and round, and then you plug that into an internal USB 2 header, and when you do it that way, when you do that, that's how you get to control all the software and everything. Now the screen itself, you do get some options. You can have it display whatever you want. And the good thing about it is this does gives you a lot of options to stuff that you can have visible, which is all really nice. And the other thing around the back of this cooler as well is there is a secondary RGB lighting section which you can have set up to change colours, and there's a few different colour change settings. You can also have it set up to I think they call it flash and dash, and then that flicks between all of the different colours. One thing I did find with the flash and dash is I found it a bit confusing that you couldn't actually choose a flash and dash colour. And my one just did it randomly, and I don't know whether you then need to use it like a secondary bit of software within the motherboard and then it links or anything, but if you've just got the standalone CPU, I couldn't find a static colour that I wanted the flash and dash to stay at, which anyway. And then you the other thing with the screen is you don't have to just have it display in one, you can flick through and it will literally just rotate between each one of those. Does make your life a little bit easier if you wanted more than one thing on it. I've got some more thoughts about the actual screens themselves when I do talk about it in a little bit. The fans themselves, these aren't Noctuas. A lot of people thought both the coolers were going to be Noctuas, and they're not. These are Asus branded fans, although because of the chamfered edges and stuff like that, they did make me think that they were like very kind of not Noctua takeoffs, but you know, they've obviously taken a lot of influence from the Noctua fans. You do get a Republic of Gamers bit of branding on one of the edges. I did think it was a shame it wasn't on both, or like either side, like diagonals. The fans will spin up to 2500 RPM, depending on how you set them in the software, and they've got 4.99mm of H2O, the static pressure thing anyway. So it's these are 5mm H2O static pressure, up to 80.95 CFM. They say 37 decibels fan noise. When they're on maxi chat, they do make a fair bit of noise though, but on low usage, I was very impressed with how good these and how quiet these were at lower RPMs, around the kind of like 1,000 to 1,500 RPM. I was very, very impressed with these. So on to the Ryujin Cooler. I'm probably going to be pronouncing it wrong, but this is the cooler that does have the Noctua fans bundled with it, and they're the server grade fans. That they're all black and they spin up to 2,000 RPM. But they've got a very low start speed of 450 RPM. So you don't need to have them blowing an absolute torrent of air. They've got rubber edges on them. They've got the proper, all of the Noctua technology. They are literally Noctua fans in the box. Now what you do need to think about is the Noctua fans just on their own they do carry a fairly hefty price tag. So these are a very expensive addition, but they're obviously probably the class leading fans available on the market, especially the fact that they now brought them out in black. That's great. As far as static pressure and stuff is concerned, they're 3.94mm H2O. They're 121.8 CFM at 2000 RPM. So they've got a huge CFM. And obviously Noctua's, because they're 2000 RPM because they're server grade fans. So they can create a hell of a lot of noise, but they don't particularly need to. All of the wires and stuff do come out the side, pretty much the same as the other one. You do still have to attach your USB cable and stuff, but with this one, it does have a detachable top. So that's like a two-way mirror. And then that's what it looks like underneath. So that's your lighting panel, and that's your little LCD screen, and they're the magnets to attach the top. But then underneath, it's very difficult to be able to get a shot of. I'll probably end up having to edit something in, but there is a fan there, and that can spin, I believe, up to 4,000 RPM, 4,800 RPM. And that does mean that it creates a hell of a lot of noise. Now, this is meant to help cool the VRMs, but as you can see, this is where the outlet for the fans is, down the bottom. So it does blow it around the CPU socket, but the amount of airflow that it does blow out isn't, yeah, it's just not the greatest. It makes a lot of noise for the actual amount of cooling ability that you get, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. I do think that it's a bit of a disappointment, this top cooler. I think it would have been nicer if we'd had a Ryuo version with the normal round top in the 360 version. Not that I don't like this, but just because it's all based around that fan, which I'm going to suggest that most people don't even bother using. I just think it's a little bit of a clunky add-on. When I very, very first saw this at the shows as well, it was a bit of a worry to me. It's probably the best way I can put it. But, you may want something nice and square on there. But the other, like I said, the other issue is it does make this screen quite small and dark. Again, the screen, you can have it set up to show whatever you want, or within reason, whatever you want within the software. So you can have it your fan speeds, the CPU speed, CPU temperature, although we do need to talk about the actual CPU temperature side of things, or cycle between, and you can do the animated GIFs and everything that you want as well. You can also add your own on both of them as well, which is actually quite a cool feature. Okay then, so we will move on to testing, and so the aesthetics and everything all come up pretty quick, but something did kind of pretty quickly become apparent. Something wasn't quite right, because you do get set fan profiles that you can load up within the AI Suite software. You've got a silent mode, you've got standard, you've got turbo, and then you've got full speed. And I'll bring the full speed graphs up, because as far as things are concerned, full speed works lovely. And when it all pops into the graphs, it fits in where you would expect. And the thing that you need to kind of consider the most are the fan speeds that you get with each of them, because that does make a fair bit of difference. That also means that you do get not as big a gap as you would expect between the two fans. Obviously, a lot of fans spins a little bit quicker, so it kind of makes up for it. The bigger one is more of the one that you'll end up wanting to run with lower fans so that you can have a quieter experience. Keep that little tidbit in mind for when we start to wrap up more towards the end. But something that I did notice is that things weren't the fans weren't ramping up where I would have expected, because I was looking at my testing. I always I have CPU-Z open, I have hardware info open, and I have hardware monitor open, and then I do my load testing with OCCT because there's a nice little timed run on there, so it turns itself off. One thing I will say is some people do get a little bit confused, but hardware info and hardware monitor both have a current temperature, a minimum temperature or lowest minimum temperature, and highest maximum temperature, and it saves those two. But you have the current one as well, so you can go back at any point, even after the run is finished, and you can see which you can still get your results. So, but I noticed that the fans weren't ramping up when I would have expected to do, because the CPU gets hot pretty much instantly with OCCT, and the fans weren't ramping up accordingly. And that was exacerbated by the fact that I was looking at my CPU temps and then looking at the actual unit itself, and they were completely different. So I just want to cut in to show this little section so that I filmed it specifically while it was running, so that you can see the difference. Rather than me showing you screenshots, you can actively see the difference between the two. So the indicated temperature on the unit set to CPU, as you can see. Now I do have to be a little bit clunky about this to keep you all zoomed in. You can see I've had OCCT running for 4.5 minutes. It's LinPack, don't have AVX connect ticked, but it's, you know, normal LinPack mode. And then over here, if I go down, you can see our actual CPU temps. Now there's 3 temps there. You've got the actual temp in the middle, then actual temp on the left. Then you've got the lowest temp in the middle, and then the highest temp on the right. So you can see there that we're, say, 63, 64 degrees. Instantly come back to the CPU cooler, and you can see it's only 52 degrees. Okay, so same situation again, but now with a 240mm cooler. You can see up here, nearly 13 minutes on OCCT, so a little longer than the last one, but it's not really the point. You can see that we're sort of 57, 58. Obviously there's going to be a few variances. You always get a hotter or a colder core. On this CPU we've got a slightly colder core on number 2, or I'd call that number 3, because obviously I'd have it 1, 2, 3, 4 and not 0. But you get the numbers there, and then we go straight back to the cooler, and you can see it's indicating 46 degrees. As you can see, it was always about 10 degrees out. And I did have a little kind of niggling, horrible feeling why. And I did ask Asus, and amazingly, the temperature that they take for that screen is actually from a probe behind the CPU on the motherboard itself. So it's technically a motherboard sensor rather than taking from the CPU. Now I understand that you're going to have multiple sensors on the CPU, but if it was me, I would have chose the packet reading, so that's like the entirety of the CPU. Now that does sound bad, but there are both good and bad reasons for it. If you wanted to use it, what I would say is, as far as that CPU temperature is concerned, you have to tune your whole system and all of your kind of thoughts around just that CPU temperature. You have to bin off all of the other software to be able to kind of adjust where your expectations will be. And because it's a motherboard temperature, you need to kind of take probably 20 degrees off of everything and aim for that. So if you would have been going for 80-ish before, you need to bring it a lot more further down. But I did notice the best case scenario was about 10 to 12 degrees cooler than the actual CPU reported temperature. But the other issue is, now this is where it gets both good and bad, is a CPU temperature will rise really quickly. The motherboard temperature will take a lot longer to work its way up. So what you will find is that you're not going to get massive ramps in fan speed. So it does make the actual usage of them a very quiet, or can be a very quiet experience. But then that also can be, if you're doing a very quick bench run where you may only be running for like a few minutes before it's finished, the system probably won't ramp up quick enough to be able to respond to those temperatures. And I have seen very hot temperatures with these, but then as the fans then do start spinning, they do start to settle again. So it depends which way you want to swing. Now, some people will say, I don't want my fans to ramp up instantly anyway. Well, in the AI Suite software, you do get a ramp up and a ramp down, sort of like delay time anyway. So you can set all that up. But because it's always going to be linked to a probe, which is technically not the CPU itself and just something that's near the CPU, it's actually behind the CPU, it's just not the most accurate of things. And I think that kind of spoils that display, because the display I think is really, really nice. But I would go as far as to say that the CPU side of that display is a bit pointless, because it's just so inaccurate. I don't think it should be called the CPU temp as far as I'm concerned. It has been a problem with AI Suite for a long time. It's not new with this, but bringing the coolers in and them having to use AI Suite has now just literally exacerbated the problem, and it has to be fixed. So the Asus need to get the software sorted out so that it's linked, or you at least, I would say, leave it the way it is, but there's a little tick option so that you can select where you want the temperature to be taken from, and you do need one which is on the CPU itself, at least as an option. I would also like to see, if I'm honest, an option for you to be able to link your graphics card, because with such a big display like that, if you know that your CPU is going to be happy as Larry and you're going to be gaming, just to be able to look over at your rig and instantly see your GPU temperature while you're in a game could be quite a settling thing. And it would be something, or even so that you could have it so it was just flicking between CPU and GPU. I think that would be a really, really nice touch as well, and it's something I think is a little bit missing on there at the moment. The other thing that I would say, as far as for me personally is concerned, I couldn't get white to work properly with the RGBs, and I think that is something that needs to be addressed as well. So technically, the coolers themselves are really nice. It just, because of the way that thermal probe is set up, it just didn't really correlate into my testing very well, which is why I've not bothered testing the silent, the standard and the turbo modes, because effectively I always have to use the maximum temperatures, and they all looked a bit hot compared to the competition, because the coolers weren't responding well enough to the surge that you can get between, because OCCT does cool down for like a 5 second, and when it swaps from doing one lot of computations to another lot of computations, and the surge between those two, the coolers just weren't, good enough, especially at the start, because it's at the start that's really the big problem, because the heat rises really, really quickly. And yeah, so in those tests, it didn't really look very well, which is why I've only put the 100% ones in the graphs, because the other ones would have all been at the bottom. And if, in honesty, it would have just been a bit unfair, because as it averages out, they did do really well. And that's because these are the only ones that I've ever tested where a motherboard temperature is really controlling the fan speeds rather than the actual CPU. So it's a bit of a cluster fudge, and that's FUDGE, not a swear word. But it just doesn't lend itself to this sort of testing, and it's something that I'm surprised hasn't really been brought up already. But in reality, and in real use, if you can get past that or adjust your fan curves accordingly, then I personally think that they've done really well. And the ones that I was surprised about more than anything was the 240mm, because they're not Noctua fans, but they've got some really good specs on them, and they were really, really quiet. My one gripe or giggle is the fact that the 360 has got that fan in. In all honesty, it doesn't really do a great deal, because it just makes noise in the end. And the other thing is, Asus, if you look at the 1151 boards, 1156 boards, all of the mid-range boards, like the Maximus boards, they've now not got VRM temperatures shown. So you can't really go on and say how well that fan is cooling, unless you move on to a competitor board like an MSI or a Gigabyte board. You would have to use it on a 2011 board. And I've done some, like loose testing just quickly, just to look at VRMs. It doesn't really do a great deal, not to the point where it just gets noisy really quickly. And I would say if people want that kind of thing, I do think they needed a 360mm version like this, because in reality, this would be the one with a 360mm rad, which I would probably suggest over that, because more people are going to need a screen than they are going to need some VRM cooling, which in reality, a decent case fan would be able to deal with better than that, and also keep the noise down, because the coolers are really so good at being able to keep the noise down that the fan within that kind of spoils it a little bit. It's almost like Asus are pandering to people that don't really understand things, if that makes any sense. They think, oh, I must have a fan in there because it will make such a great deal of difference, when in reality, if you set your system up properly or you buy the right bits, then you don't really need that in the first place, unless you're a crazy hardcore overclocker or like absolute bench mental runs. And then you would know that that's an area that may need slightly better fans at the top of your case or something. So, you know, in that, I just don't get it with that 360. But the good thing is, if you do get the 360, you can just go into AI Suite, find the fan in AI Suite and literally put all the levels down to 0, and you can turn it off, which is what I would do if I was going to use it long term. But I'd still sit there looking at it, wishing the screen was bigger. The other thing that you can do, thankfully, is you can, if you want, manually set up a fan curve for your pump. Now, I wouldn't set it down really, really low, but find a really nice, happy medium for the pump speed, and you don't really need it to go nuts. And if you do that, you can actually set them up to be quiet. Any of the profiles, though, with the pump speeds, I would adjust every single one of them, other than silent, because if you're in a quiet room, you probably, especially using their fan profiles, bearing in mind that the fans won't be ramping up really very quickly, you will end up hearing the pump. So I would always change the pump profile a little bit. Just keep an eye on your temps, and I think you'll be surprised how little the fluid really needs to be moving to keep the actual temperatures and everything down. So the long and short of it is, with a quick recap, software is letting it down a bit, if I'm honest, on multiple levels, especially on that CPU temp. But also because then the fan profiles are set so far out that it's just, we need something directly linked to that CPU temperature. I personally think it's a lot easier to get your head around, a lot easier to set up. You kind of have to sit there and play around with it for so long and ignore all other temperatures, and then move all the fan curves right down so that you can actually get something that you're going to be happy with. But they can be really, really quiet, which is what I really like. I love the screen on the Ryuo, and I think it's a shame that the Ryuo one, there isn't a 360 version as well. So, long and short of it is, I do like them. Thankfully, most of the issues can be fixed in the software, and I think the only other thing is with the 360, I would like a Ryuo version of it, just so that we can have that big screen for those of us that know that that fan's probably going to be making more noise than it's ever going to give us cooling benefits. So, there is a lot to kind of get your head around, especially with the software side of things. I really do genuinely hope Asus get that addressed quickly, because that's literally the only thing that's spoiling these, in my honesty, especially this one. This would actually be my favourite. Randomly, I should like the 360, but because of the aesthetics, I'm gonna favour this one in the end, just because of that lovely screen. The fans do really well. Get that software sorted, and they are very, very good units. So I'm going to leave that with you. You can decide whether it's going to wind you up or not. I'm hoping Asus get them fixed. If they get them fixed, what I will do is I will run them, and by getting them fixed, I mean the software, so it's linked to the CPU and all that sort of stuff. I will run them again in my normal test suite, and I will pad out the rest of the graphs with the results. But to this point, I don't really think that I can, other than making them not necessarily look really bad, but it would be unfair results because they will be tested in such a completely different way to everything else in the graphs. So I will love you and leave that with you. You can tell me what you think in the comments underneath. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. This has been the tiniest of Logans. Out. Ding!